and thank you for joining Decide DeKalb Development Authority for Economic Development Week. One of the topics we wanted to discuss during Economic Development Week are tax allocation districts. So we're happy as Decide DeKalb Development Authority to present to you today the ABCs of tax allocation districts. My name is Dorian DeBarr. I proudly lead Decide DeKalb Development Authority as president. I've been in this seat since 2019. Enjoyed every single thing when I'm doing as president here in DeKalb County. We've had phenomenal success as an authority and as an agency. And one of the principal charges of Decide DeKalb is to drive economic development and economic prosperity across the entirety of DeKalb County. We do this in a number of ways, whether it's human capital and just the good staff we have here, helping businesses to thrive and grow, and even attracting businesses to DeKalb County. And we do that in a number of ways. And one of the ways we do that is through a little known tool called the Tax Allocation District. And we want to give some insight on this tool as to why it's important, not only in DeKalb County, but also the entire region of Atlanta. And we'll give you some examples. So that's a little bit about me, and I want to hand it over to Jonathan to tell you about a little bit about himself.
I'm Jonathan Gelber. I'm Vice President in an Atlanta-based real estate and finance consulting firm called KB Advisory Group. And I have been specializing in TADs in one way or the other since about 2003. So that's over 20 years now. And I represent cities, counties, and communities who are creating and administering TADs. And I've also represented individuals and clients and developers and property owners who are within TADs who are trying to apply for TAD funding. So I've worked all over the realm of TADs, and I'm excited to see there's a lot of growth in TADs lately and a lot of new things are happening.
Absolutely. Thank you for that introduction, Jonathan. And I'd like to add that I myself have been attached to and working with tax allocation districts for the better part of a decade. I've known Jonathan and had the pleasure of knowing him for quite some time, and he is definitely a TAD guru. So with that guru title that I just gave you, Jonathan, give us and the audience your summary of what a tax allocation district is and just the ins and outs of a TAD.
Okay, well, it can be kind of daunting and complicated, but it's really not that complicated. So what a tax allocation district is a defined boundary. And in the state of Georgia, we call it tax allocation district. Every other state in the world, we call it tax increment financing. I don't know why it's different here, but it is. But the TAD allocation district, or TAD, is a boundary where this kind of financing can be used. And what that means is that every property that is in this boundary that has to be found, first of all, to be designated as underdeveloped or blighted. You have to prove legally that everything in this boundary is underdeveloped or blighted, and you have to prove that you have a plan and a goal for what you want to do with this thing. You have to have an outcome in mind. Once that goal is established, every property that's in that continues to pay their property taxes as they normally would. But when it gets to the tax commissioner's office, the tax commissioner takes some of the money and says, we're going to put this in a special bank account called the TAD fund, Tax Allocation District Fund. And the money in that fund has to be spent on something back in that district that's eligible, generally infrastructure, bricks, mortar, building. So anything that you can physically build to make that community improved or a better place that's in line with your goals, that money can be used to spend that. Now, that's all behind the scenes. That doesn't apply to a regular consumer or a business or someone who wants to see if they can maybe apply for TAD funds. What matters on the other side is the deals that happen within that TAD fund. So once that fund is set up, anybody, whether that's a developer, whether that's a school board, whether that's transportation, transit agency, a property owner, a small business, anybody who wants funding to help do something in that district can apply to the TAD redevelopment agency, which in this case is Decide DeKalb, and say, we have this project, we think it's consistent with the vision of your plan. We need a subsidy to make this happen. Can we have some money out of that TAD bank account to make this thing happen, which is consistent with your goals?
Absolutely. And I love the way you explain that, Jonathan. And
Yeah.
you know, one way I like to explain it, especially when I talk to community members, is that, typically you have a county's general fund or these other special revenue funds that they have, and then everybody's picking at the pie for sidewalks. But when you have a tax allocation district, it really, to your point, sets aside this special fund that is for the benefit of this particular community.
Right.
And that
And
community can pull from these funds and is not allocated elsewhere for these particular redevelopment type project or infrastructure type improvements that these communities that you said earlier are typically undeveloped and they need those improvements.
Right. And the hope is that the kind of investments we are making using this TAD funding are what we call catalytic investments. So not a lot is happening in terms of real estate or development or jobs or infrastructure. And you figure if we can spend, if we can build a better sidewalk, if we can get a better business going, if we can recruit this company to have a new building, or if the school can have improvements, then that investment in that specific project might make everything about it get a little better. And that might make the next deal easier. Then the deal after that gets a little bit easier until the area has its own steam going. Then you don't need to use the TAD district anymore.
Correct, correct. And that's what we're talking about when you're talking about increment, like increment finance and tax allocation districts. You want the
Yes.
increment to continue to build up and step up, so you have more funding available to, again, promote certain projects, put money towards certain projects. But to your point, Jonathan, you want to get it to a point where you can say, we don't even need a tax allocation district anymore.
Yes.
So with that being said, I think one thing that's super important is for folks to understand, you know, when we talk about tax allocation districts, you have to have what we call jurisdiction participation, which is a big one in tax allocation districts. And just so the audience can know, that means that you have participation from the local municipality, which is DeKalb County government in our case. And then you also want participation because on your property tax bill, you have the school district as well. School districts in the state of Georgia have to explicitly state and formally agree to be a part of a tax allocation district, and also cities in the case as well if you have cities. So did I get that right, Jonathan?
Yeah, that is right. That the local jurisdiction, whether it's a city or county, they generally are the ones who sponsor a TAD district. They decide we think that this is a good idea in this area. And in most cases, the city tax is or the county tax is a little bit less than half of the total tax bill, and the school board is a little bit more than half. So a school board can choose to participate in that TAD and say, we're willing to give up some of our money because we believe that putting some of our money instead of into the school pockets, putting it back into the TAD, that will create investment in the TAD, which will over time create more value for us. But they have to volunteer to participate in that.
Yep. Yeah, and I think one important thing, Jonathan, and maybe you could help us with this one is, what's the typical timeline on a TAD?
Well, one thing I want to make clear that I think is real important, that a TAD itself is the legal structure around the TAD that gives us the power to use this thing.
Mhm.
Setting up the TAD can take anywhere from 1 to 3 years, but the fact is that's your problem, that's my problem, that's not people who want to use the TAD's problem. Once that TAD is set up, then it's really just a matter of your own internal policies of how long it takes between starting the process saying we applicants would like this much money for this project. It generally takes about 6 months or 12 or more for a complicated project.
Mhm.
But I don't want to focus on the setup because the setup is all stuff that you and I are paid to think about and do. And I want to really make this easy and available to people who can use this money, whether that is city agencies, whether that is nonprofits, whether that's property owners or small businesses or local developers or big giant developers. Whoever that is, that's who we're focusing on. So again, it is the TAD deal where the rubber hits the road. The individual negotiations and the individual grants from the TAD is where the magic happens. Having the TAD set up is essentially just like buying a tool and keeping it in your garage. That tool is not useful until you say, well, what am I going to build with it? Have I got the wood? Have I got the screws and nails? Have I got the plans? Then going out there on Saturday and grinding your machines. That's where the magic happens.
Okay. And speaking of that, and I think this is a good follow-up. So people typically get excited. I could be talking to a room about tax allocation districts, and then I like to give them examples. So if you can give us a couple of examples in the region of what a TAD could look like and what success could look like.
Okay, absolutely. I'm happy to talk about that. I have my own favorite TAD that I talk about all the time. But
Okay.
first, let's talk about that. The TADs you read about in the newspaper are always big, giant mixed-use redevelopments that take 8 years or more, or that have a lot of lawyers and a lot of development companies and a lot of big high-rise buildings. Atlantic Station is a version of that. Atlantic Station happened because of one of the first TADs in Georgia. So we had this old steel factory. When they tore it down, the land was completely contaminated. And so you could not, no developer or builder could go in there and build something without spending millions of dollars on environmental remediation. So they set up the TAD, and what that TAD did is it did the remediation of the site and then also built all those big concrete parking deck platforms with all those holes in the middle. And then individual developers or property owners could start coming in and filling in the holes on the site. So the TAD enabled the site to get ready to build, and then individual market rate development happened there. So that's a big one, but that kind of distracts and scares most people. I like to talk about the medium and the small ones. So a medium example is a lot of people know how cool the town of Duluth, Georgia, up in Gwinnett County is. That is really one of the best examples of a local small town converting itself from kind of something downtrodden into one of the most desirable, fun places to hang out in the world. They did that almost all through tax allocation district funding. A lot of little deals, and sometimes the TAD money was to build public something, build a plaza, build a park, build a fountain, build a sidewalk, build an overpass. And a lot of it was to help developers saying, I'd love to build this restaurant, but right now the market dynamics aren't there. But if I had a little bit of extra, we could make this deal work and I could get investors in. So they helped a lot of little deals come up with a medium, very, very cool place. Infrastructure is great. The Atlanta Beltline, for example, was built with a TAD. That would not have been built. The city would not have had that money to build that TAD, but they figure what's often described as let's build the beach and then we'll sell the beachfront property against the beach. So the Atlanta thought if we build this, if we let ourselves borrow money funded by a TAD to build this cool thing, then suddenly everyone will want to build all these apartments and condos and restaurants and stores and corporate headquarters. Right now, I'm sitting in an office building that is the most expensive office building in the city of Atlanta, which happens to be on the Atlanta Beltline. And we did a market study on this building 20 years ago or 15 years ago, and we thought that's never going to work. That's the worst idea. You could never have an office there. Now it's the most expensive building in the city of Atlanta because they built this Beltline and this waterfront park next door. So that's infrastructure. But let me tell you about my favorite example. In city of Gainesville, in a tax allocation district, there was this rundown little law office. It was a miserable old building, clad with vinyl from the 1960s. And it went up for sale in 2017. And some local restaurateurs said, we want to put a restaurant there. And so they started building, or they bought this thing for $300,000. They started tearing apart, and they saw that under the vinyl skin of this ugly old building that had been a law office or a used car lot, they saw it was one of those classic old 1930 style gas stations. And all the bones were still there. And they're like, we want to restore this old gas station. But one of the things we need to do is we need to build out this canopy where the pumps used to be, because that's where it would be a dining area of our restaurant. And they needed $60,000 more than they thought. And someone at Gainesville said, hey, did you guys know you're in a TAD? Why don't you apply for that? So these guys applied for just $60,000 of funding to do the steel work for the canopy. That helped them finish the building. They restored the building. They opened up a cool local brew pub. And now that building, a couple of years later, is worth $1 million. It employs something like 20 or 30 people in terms of owners, cooks, waiters, waitresses, managers. And that was the first of what's now like 20 new brew pubs and restaurants. And it turned this really rundown commercial strip into a cool strip. So it catalyzed all the development around it. And that cost the city of Gainesville $60,000. And they had the foresight to take on that risk. They said, well, we're just going to give you guys $60,000 up front. We're not going to bond. We're not going to pay as you go. We're just going to have faith that you'll get this done. $60,000 is a drop in the bucket to us. So go ahead and take this. And that's how small businesses, small owners can use. So these guys are property owners and a local small business. So they created jobs, they catalyzed this corridor, and all of the money given to them is being recirculated inside this local community. That the guys who own it live in Gainesville, the guys who do the work live in Gainesville, and the people who work there live in Gainesville. So all of that money has been recirculated. And that is my favorite TAD story. It's called Standard Service, if you ever go up there.
Because that's what economic development is. And it's not always the huge projects, it's incremental projects that cause a larger change.
Yeah, and that's an important thing here too, because a lot of tax allocation districts that are blighted, like the one we made in Southwest DeKalb, a lot of it is these commercial corridors and these commercial, little commercial neighborhood areas. And you're not going to have these big national developers who say, I want to build a giant mixed use there. It's going to, remember, in any cool district that starts to emerge, the first people in there are the art galleries, the coffee houses, maybe even like a tattoo parlor or a bicycle repair shop or a brew pub. Those are always the first people in. So you want to make it really easy for them to do the first three, four, five things. You know, you think about the neighborhood of Soho in New York. That got cool because there were all these abandoned industrial buildings. So the artists and the squatters and the rock and rollers came in, and now suddenly it's all corporate headquarters and, you know, top star fashion and totally unaffordable. Not if that's a good example, I don't know. But they always get started by these little guys. They want to make it easy for the little guys and the local guys to get in there and do work.
Yeah. And what are some of the challenges you see with tax allocation districts? And what is a lot of the are there any negatives that the audience should know about?
Well, operationally, there can be some negatives. So, for example, let's think about schools and police and community services. So, one of the deals with the TAD is, let's say you use TAD funding to create a new residential project that has 100 kids living in it. Then the new incremental property taxes from that new building are going to go into the TAD funding. And the schools will get mad at you because you'll say, what? You're sending me 100 new kids, but you're not sending me any new money because the money that would normally come from those taxes is being put back into the TAD fund. So often, if there's an increase in services or public services, such as police services or fire services or schools, then there might be some problems, but there's mechanisms in a TAD for those things to be repaid. It's what we called a pilot or a payment in lieu of taxes, which means the schools will say, okay, we'll only agree with you if you pull some of that money out to help cover the additional costs. And I think we talked about that quite a bit with the Southwest DeKalb. So that is one of the problems. Another problem is it's really hard to explain to people what it is. So there's a lot of misinformation about TADs out there, and people will get all riled up and start writing on Nextdoor and Facebook about what's happening that's really not what's happening. Well, I think one thing that often happens with TADs is we focus too much on the financial aspect of the TADs. How much is it going to cost? How much value it's going to create? How much is it going to cost to service? And so what I always counsel my clients to do is to go back to the beginning and remember, why are you doing this TAD? You're not doing the TAD to create value in the TAD. You're not doing the TAD to spend money. You're not doing the TAD to give money to certain organizations or individuals. You are doing deals within this TAD to solve the goals that you set up at the beginning. You had a priority to improve the community in these different ways. And as part of setting up a TAD, you have to be very explicit about what are the goals and priorities of this TAD and how will you spend the money. So in any kind of good redevelopment, it's not just going to be infrastructure. It's not just going to be getting a building out of the ground, but it's got to be made up of parks and roads and paths and bicycles and apartments and businesses and workplaces and restaurants. That these communities are built up of all these different things. And so we should always remember that any individual TAD grant is serving part of this larger goal that you have mapped out and get you one step, not all the way to the end, but get you one step closer and one step closer. And the faster you start going, the easier it is to take the next step and get to the end goal.
I love that. I love that. From this seat as president of Decide DeKalb Development Authority, I want to make it clear that we have a focus to unlock the potential of all of DeKalb County. We've done some phenomenal projects across the county. We've done close to $2 billion in investments, close to 8,000 jobs since 2022. And for us, a tax allocation district unlocks the opportunities of other undeveloped portions of the county, which makes us a better county, a more whole county, and just takes us to another level with respect to livability and just quality of life improvement. So last year we worked hard and we worked with Jonathan's group. So thank you, Jonathan, for helping us with this. We worked hard to unlock and create this Southwest DeKalb Tax Allocation District. And ultimately, the idea is just to what we've been talking about today, taking this undeveloped community, a community that has been historically underinvested in. And you could look at many data points, history, reports. This community needs investment. So we had the wherewithal to create this tax allocation district to be super intentional about driving these investments and what we've talked about today into this community in a meaningful way, in a deliberate way. We're excited about it. This TAD just started beginning of this year, actually. So we have some work to do, but here at Decide DeKalb, we are committed and we are excited about it. So Anything else you want to add about that, Jonathan? Because your group did a lot of work on this tab, and so you
Right.
are intimately familiar with it.
Yeah. So one of the things we did is we helped define the boundary of where should this tab be, where should this tab not be. And so we used a lot of analysis and both technical analysis, but also human intelligence. We talked to a lot of people, talked to a lot of organizations, looked at a lot of plans to determine what parts in Southwest DeKalb do people generally want to see something different, where do we want to see change or growth or redevelopment, and what do we want to protect and not mess with at all. And so we very carefully drew this line to focus on the areas where people broadly want to see some sort of change, investment, or redevelopment. So we focused on the areas in the far southwest where there's a lot of film studio activity going on. There's a lot of economic development opportunity. And also there's a lot of industrial thing because a huge part of this TAD is building up your industrial base, building up jobs, and just reminding everybody that the more your businesses are paying in taxes, then the less your residents have to pay in taxes. So that's one of the big parts of fiscal and economic development. We also looked at a lot of aging industrial sites and truck yards and so on. Which of these are kind of out of favor that could maybe convert into either a better industrial use or a better commercial use, or even get flipped over into some sort of mixed use or residential use. So we put in a lot of these sort of blighted or underdeveloped things. We went all the way over to the Gallery at South DeKalb Mall area, and we brought in that mall because a lot of people have expressed interest in seeing that mall redevelop, and also a lot of the shopping centers around that mall. So we brought them in, and then we also brought in the Candler Road corridor, where there's a lot of underdeveloped properties. They're not necessarily vacant, but there's a lot of properties that are big properties that have, an old use that might need, like an old dry cleaner or an old car wash, where there could probably be a better use there, but it's sort of hard to redevelop those small commercial lots. So we want to create a way where it's easier for people to redevelop or improve or build something new or better on those small commercial lots. So that's how we ended up with that boundary. And I'm real excited about the opportunities there.
Absolutely. So thank you for that, Jonathan. And again, thank you all for participating in viewing this recording on tax allocation districts, the ABCs of tax. Again, here at Decide DeKalb and in DeKalb County, we're excited about the potential. And as a reminder, in DeKalb County, we have 5 tax allocation districts. We have the most recent one is Southwest DeKalb tab, Southwest DeKalb tab. Before that, we had the Market Square tab, which Jonathan helped with to create that one as well. And then the other 3 would be Avondale, Kensington, and Broadcliff. So we have those 5 tax allocation districts here under the guidance of the DeKalb County government. There are a couple of others, some municipalities, some cities have one. Avondale has its own, but today we're talking about those that are
There's
under.
a couple in the city of Decatur too.
Correct, and the city of Decatur, but today we're talking about these 5
Right.
tags that are under the direction of the DeKalb County government. So excited to have this conversation. Decide DeKalb is open for business. DeKalb County is open for business. Please reach out to us if you have any additional questions. Our website is www.decidedecalb.com, and we'll be happy to answer any additional question you might have.